The Nun, The Devil Inside, The Ritual, Seed of Chucky. What do all these film titles have in common? Yes, they are all horror movies, but even more particularly, they were all filmed in Romania. That's how creepy Romania is, home of Dracula, the iconic Transylvanian vampire. But even as creepy as Romania is, there's one part of the country that's so blood-curdling that no one would ever willingly set foot there, let alone set up camp to shoot an entire movie. I'm talking about the Hoia Baciu, the Bermuda Triangle of Romania, ominously named after the local shepherd who entered the forest with his 200 sheep and was never seen or heard from again. As a rule, Adam never believed in omens or the paranormal. As far as he was concerned, any high strangeness at all could be explained using natural means, and reaching for extraordinary explanations was simply that, reaching. Well, in 2023, Adam visited Hoia Baciu on a dare, and his entire worldview changed forever. Right before his trip, Adam said, "If I believed in omens, I would have been running for the hills." Looking back, he really should have, because what he experienced would leave him permanently traumatized. Here's how the story went. Needless to say, it's a true life story, with the details slightly changed for the subject's privacy. As Adam tells it, on the precise morning that he was to visit Hoia Baciu, everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong one after the other. First, he got into a fight with the receptionist at his hotel. Then, he lost his credit cards. Then he got sick. Violently sick. It was like all the forces of nature had come together to warn him against his planned trip. Still, Adam was adamant, pun intended, and insisted on carrying on. Fortunately for him, he later found his credit cards, and soon after that, his nausea wave subsided a bit, allowing him to begin his trip. In hindsight, he probably should have just taken his many misfortunes as a sign to stay back. But he didn't, and so, the next part of the story gets significantly more bizarre. It took a stressful hike up a steep hill before Adam and his guide finally landed in Hoia Baciu. And the first thing Adam noticed was that the forest was much cooler than expected. The reason for that, as our tourists would eventually come to find out, is that the sun's rays just don't seem to penetrate into this forest. Which takes us to the trees. The trees were the weirdest thing Adam had ever seen in his life. Rather than shoot straight up like any other tree, the trees looked bent and twisted at impossible angles. Never had he seen such misshapen trees in his life, nor had his botanist friend, whom he sent pictures of the trees to. And then he got sick again, and this time, it was significantly worse. Besides his upset stomach, Adam also felt a tightness in his chest and stabbing pains in his head, symptoms he simply couldn't trace to any one issue. Ever the skeptic, though, Adam concluded that his strange symptoms were unrelated to his trip into the haunted forest and that they'd have developed whether or not he took the trip. But then, curiously, once the trip was over, Adam found that all of his symptoms disappeared. The nausea ended, the headache vanished, and Adam felt completely fine. At this point, it was hard not to connect the dots, but Adam had bigger issues on his mind. Hoia Baciu obviously wasn't good for people, and he really just wanted to get the heck out of the area and never set foot there again. Stories like Adam's are far from the exception when it comes to Hoia Baciu. In fact, Adam's experience at Hoia Baciu seems to be a lot milder than the truly blood-curdling experiences people have had at Hoia Baciu. Also known as the Bermuda Triangle of Romania, Hoia Baciu is a tiny forest about 1 square mile in size, that sits on a tract of land in Cluj-Napoca, Romania. And when they call a place the Bermuda Triangle of its country, it probably tells you everything you need to know, right? Mysterious disappearances, UFO sightings, ghost apparitions, you name it. Hoia Baciu has it all. As I already mentioned, the name Hoia Baciu is a form of homage. Decades ago, a shepherd named Hoia Baciu wandered into the forest with his 200 sheep and never made it out. In honor of the shepherd, therefore, the forest was thus named after him. What happened to Hoia Baciu? What happened to all 200 of his sheep? To this day, no one knows. But even as chilling as that tale is, it still isn't the only major disappearance story connected to Hoia Baciu. According to local legend, there was another major disappearance in Hoia Baciu, this time involving a 5-year-old girl. Now, here comes the strange part. After 5 years, the little girl returned from the forest, except she still had on exactly what she had been wearing on the day she disappeared. Even more strangely, the now 10-year-old girl could not recall how she got abducted or what had happened to her in the years during her disappearance. With 2 major chilling stories like these surrounding Hoia Baciu and many other lesser-known lores connected to the forest, most natives who live close to the forest have learned to leave it alone by now, scared that they'd never come back if they ventured into the forest. However, as you'd expect, there are always those with the devil-may-care attitude, or perhaps they simply weren't as familiar with the tales of Hoia Baciu. Those ones have come back with tales to tell, and for the die-hard skeptics, many of their tales come backed with hard photographic evidence, which, of course, I'm going to be exploring in this video. Perhaps the first thing that stuns anyone who visits Hoia Baciu is the strange ways the trees grow. Just like Adam mentioned, the trees in Hoia Baciu are oddly shaped and bent at impossible angles. And it's not just the bizarre shape in which they grow. These trees are also impossibly strong. According to those who have tried, the trees are so tough that it's literally impossible to cut through them. It's also said that the trees are impervious to rain, as they never get wet even under heavy rainfall. But it gets much weirder. As one goes deeper into the forest, every now and again, you stumble on trees with human faces carved into them. The identities of the people behind the faces on the tree trunks, as well as the identities of the persons who carved these mysterious faces, remains unknown. But once again, it gets weirder. As you keep walking into the forest, you'll arrive at a clearing at the center. The clearing is perfectly circular, but also strangely barren, at least when compared to the rest of the forest. Unlike the rest of the forest that's thick with trees, the clearing at the center of the forest has no single tree in it, almost as if an unseen force was keeping trees from growing within that clearing. Study after study has been carried out on soil samples from that weird clearing, and yet, no cause has been found for the bizarre nature of that area. Science simply doesn't know why that clearing is so barren. The same way science struggles to explain why electronic gadgets randomly develop faults and malfunction altogether in Hoia Baciu, or why time appears to dilate when in this forest, or why the forest appears to shapeshift in a way. People have found themselves walking in one direction, only to end up in a totally different direction from the one they were walking initially. Then there are the bodily symptoms as well. Adam may have thought that his symptoms were unrelated to his trip to Hoia Baciu, but judging from the consistent accounts coming from people who have wandered into Hoia Baciu, these symptoms couldn't possibly be unrelated. We find people entering Hoia Baciu and spontaneously developing symptoms in their bodies like strange rashes, headaches, burns, scratches, and nausea. Psychologically, we have people suddenly getting anxious or developing a sense that they are being watched. Perhaps what's even more curious is the fact that these symptoms somehow spontaneously end once the affected people leave the forest and its vicinity. Could this be coincidence? Of course. There's always that possibility. But if we're going to be honest, then we'd have to first agree that that possibility is very low, though it may exist. The truth has to be that there's something weird about Hoia Baciu. Alright, so we've explored most of the bewildering mysteries about Hoia Baciu. The question now, though, is, how exactly do we account for these things? What's causing all the strange happenings in this forest? Is Hoia Baciu truly haunted? Or is there something else going on here? Well, as you might have already suspected, there are multiple theories. By the 50s, the mysterious stories of Hoia Baciu had become widespread, attracting the attention of a wide range of people, including Professor Alexandru Sift, a biologist. The many stories about Hoia Baciu by the locals had left Sift intrigued, and so he decided he was going to check out this forest for himself. The first thing Sift observed once he landed in Hoia Baciu was that there seemed to be a series of strange shadows following him just above the trees. What were these shadows? Sift had no clue, but since he had his camera, he decided to take numerous photos of the object before it disappeared out of view. The pictures didn't help much, as Sift still had no clue what had been following him and why. Not until a year later when Sift returned to Hoia Baciu and captured another similar aerial object flying over the area. This time, Sift hung around a bit after taking his photo, and his patience paid off. The very next day, the professor discovered a circular track on the ground. The track was so huge, about 5 meters in diameter. But what was even more suspicious was the fact that the track remained visible from that time in the 50s and only vanished in 2009, which raises a lot of questions, like, what left this circular track on the ground? What was it made of? Where is this object now? Was this evidence of alien life forms in Hoia Baciu? Well, Sift definitely thought so, but we don't have to take his word for it, especially since we no longer have access to his extensive archive of photos and research work. This is where military technician Emil Barnea enters the picture. So, in August 1968, Emil Barnea, his girlfriend, and a couple of their friends made their way into Hoia Baciu for a picnic. As the group went about their activities, Barnea's girlfriend noticed and drew her boyfriend's attention to a silver disc flying just overhead. As fate would have it, Barnea had his camera with him, and so he was able to take a few good photos before the object disappeared altogether. Once he got home after the picnic, Barnea immediately developed the photos and then proceeded to share them with the local papers. The backlash, however, was swift. Most people responded skeptically, calling Barnea's UFO a weather balloon or a blimp. But of course, Barnea was convinced that whatever he had seen darting around that night was not a mere weather balloon or a blimp. It was something otherworldly, a theory that independent investigators would eventually confirm. As the story goes, some investigators looked into the weather balloon/blimp angle, but it didn't check out. There were no weather balloons, blimps, or any other aerial objects in the sky at the date and time when Barnea observed the UFO. To be double sure, The investigators even examined Barnea's negatives just to confirm that Barnea hadn't tampered with the photos. But once again, Barnea's photos turned out to be authentic on that count as well. So could Hoia Baciu really be an alien base? Well, the mysterious disappearances in this forest seem to prove that. If you recall, we talked about a story of a 5-year-old girl who disappeared into Hoia Baciu and then reappeared 5 years later wearing the same clothes, right? Now, anyone who's familiar with alien abduction lore can definitely pick up on the similar themes in the Hoia Baciu disappearance story. Perhaps the most striking similarity between both is the memory loss. There's hardly any alien abduction lore that does not include an element of amnesia to the point where, in most cases, abductees have to be subjected to hypnotic therapy to regain the lost memories. From Betty and Barney Hill in 1961 to the Ariel school encounter in 1994, reports of missing time have become a staple of alien abduction narratives. Which is why the disappearance of the 5-year-old girl seems to provide the strongest evidence that there's an alien base at Hoia Baciu. An alien abduction, as left field as some skeptics might consider it to be, seems to be the best theory to explain that mystery. By the way, I did a deep dive into the Betty and Barney Hill alien abduction story, as well as the Ariel school encounter. So if you want to explore that, be sure to check the description for links to the video. But there are other things that start to make sense if we assume an alien base at Hoia Baciu. Take the electromagnetic anomalies, for instance. That's a common report that features in nearly every account of a UFO encounter. Then, of course, we can't forget the mysterious circular clearing at the center of the forest. As I mentioned earlier, soil samples from that clearing have been tested, and nothing significant has been found to explain the reason for the barrenness of the clearing. But what if this was the effect of radiation? Think about it. The clearing is almost perfectly circular in shape. So, what if this was the landing spot for the mothership? Considering that UFO sites are known to show signs of radiation, it could be that the landing of the mothership at the center of the forest released some radiation onto the site, making the site uninhabitable for plant growth. Once again, it would make perfect sense. But an alien base isn't the only theory that has been proposed in an attempt to understand Hoia Baciu. So, let's consider another one, which happens to be the most popular theory. So, not everybody is on board for this alien base theory. For some others, actually for most people, the explanation for the mysterious activities boils down to your textbook Poltergeist activity. In other words, Hoia Baciu is being haunted by ghosts. Now, does this theory hold water? Well, there's pretty good evidence backing this theory. So, first off, it is said that Hoia Baciu was the site of an ancient Neolithic settlement that dates as far back as 6500 BC. Altogether, that's about 8,500 years ago, a long time as you can see. It's not clear when exactly Hoia Baciu stopped being habitable, but it's safe to say that since 6500 BC, thousands of people have lived and died in that area. In fact, there's a local lore that a group of peasants were killed in that forest and that their ghosts now haunt the area, causing the strange experiences people tend to have in Hoia Baciu. Of course, the haunted theory could sound just a teeny bit Hollywood, but there's this incident that happened in Hoia Baciu some years ago that's almost impossible to explain any other way. So, for years, visitors to Hoia Baciu have reported experiencing poltergeist activity while on their trips. Disembodied voices like murmurings and loud shrieks, apparitions, even down to physical attacks involving shoving, scratching, and pulling were all happening. Take this case for instance. The crew of the popular sci-fi show Destination Truth was filming on set at Hoia Baciu. The team had heard all about this haunted forest and wanted to shoot an episode about the place, so they made their way down. Well, in the process of shooting, one of the cameramen, Evan, went into the mysterious circular clearing at the center of the forest to do an EVP isolation session. Basically, he wanted to isolate the strange voices going around in the forest. Anyway, as he was doing that, he suddenly felt himself forcefully shoved to the ground by an invisible being. And then, after that, he found 3 scratches on his forearm, which he described as having an itchy and burning sensation. I don't know about you, but that sounds like the work of a ghost. Or how else do you explain an invisible force pushing a grown man down and giving him scratches on his arm, leaving a burning sensation behind? When we add up all the factors, the poltergeist theory does appear to be reasonable. But there's one more theory to consider before we look at the other side of the conversation. What if Hoia Baciu leads to another dimension? Okay, so far we've explored the alien base theory, the haunted theory, and now we want to look at the third most popular theory. Interestingly, this theory is kinda close to the haunted theory. Basically, the theory proposes that Hoia Baciu is indeed haunted, but not by ghosts. Okay, so to understand this, we first have to understand what liminal spaces are. When we talk about liminal spaces, we're referring to a threshold connecting 2 points. An example of a liminal space in our physical world could be like a tunnel or a bridge. However, there are also liminal spaces that connect different spatial dimensions as well, allowing for the movement of entities in and out of our dimensions. Some people say that liminal spaces act as a repository for lost spirits, but spirits aren't the only beings that access liminal spaces. Interdimensional beings, like ultra-terrestrials for instance, also make use of liminal spaces. Now, liminal spaces have a couple of characteristics. The first is that they tend to show a high level of paranormal activity, which we observe in Hoia Baciu. I already listed many of them, but I want to draw attention to a few particularly weird ones. For instance, there seems to be this weird spatial bending that takes place in the forest. Visitors have reported feeling an abrupt sense of disorientation, where they end up finding themselves in a completely different area from the direction they had initially been on. Then there are the time dilation reports as well. Some have gone into the forest, only to leave many hours later than expected, with no memory whatsoever of how they spent the lost time. Then there's the disappearing and reappearing of personal items, the enigmatic fog, and the wide range of sudden and unexplainable symptoms observed at the weird circular clearing at the center of the forest. It's not uncommon for tourists to complain of severe bodily discomfort, like burns, mysterious scrapes, nausea, and heightened anxiety. Compasses and electronics are also known to malfunction randomly, to the point where full batteries suddenly run down without any prior warning. All these seem to be activities characteristic of liminal spaces. For perspective, let's compare other known liminal spaces in the world. A very good example would be Mount Kailash. By the way, I have an entire video on this mysterious mountain and the high strangeness that goes. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I'll leave the link in the description. In the meantime, Mount Kailash is perhaps one of the most mysterious places on Earth, with paranormal reports that closely mirror what we see at Hoia Baciu. For instance, we've had reports of mysterious disappearances, where people climb Kailash and never make it back down. We've also had time dilation cases, with people aging rapidly while climbing the mountain. Some have even come back to report that the mountain shifted positions as they climbed, landing them in a totally different position from the direction they were on originally. These are all reports we've seen in Hoia Baciu as well, which further strengthens the idea that Hoia Baciu might just be a liminal space. Another major feature of liminal spaces is that they tend to give off high spiritual energy, which is another interesting thing about Hoia Baciu. The area is known for its high energy state, which is probably why it was used by certain groups as a sacred site. The ancient Dacians, for instance, used Hoia Baciu as one of their sacred sites for carrying out their religious rituals because of the high energy emanating from the forest. This further proves that Hoia Baciu could indeed be a liminal space. And if Hoia Baciu is a liminal space, then all of the high strangeness going on there also starts to make sense. It would also mean that all the paranormal activities attributed to ghosts and aliens might actually just be interdimensional beings, which I've got to admit is a much scarier thought, because at least we're somewhat familiar with extraterrestrial beings. Anyway, those are the three major theories about Hoia Baciu. But it's time to take a look at the other side of the conversation, the more skeptical side. And I'm not going to lie, even though I'm always open to both sides of the story, this time I've got to say that the skeptical argument is very, very convincing. The stories around Hoia Baciu are definitely interesting and even bone-chilling. However, when you continue to poke into these stories with the stick of reality, they begin to fall apart one after the other. Let's begin with the story of the 5-year-old girl who mysteriously disappeared into the forest only to reappear 5 years later. To begin with, even the story itself has so many versions that deciphering which one is the true account of events is next to impossible. Some say the girl reappeared 5 years later, wearing the same clean clothes she wore when she disappeared, and that she also appeared not to have any memory of her disappearance. But another version of the story claims that she came back as a completely different person. In fact, the little girl was darker upon her return, if the second version is to be believed. But that's not even where things get naughty. Brian Dunning, a skeptical researcher, claims that he spent hours trying to track down the story, even searching through Romanian-language newspaper archives, but he found nothing. He wasn't able to find a name or the specific time when the event happened. There's simply no record that any such disappearance took place. Obviously, this isn't ultimate proof that the incident never happened. However, when you consider the extenuating factors, it seems to be in this case that the absence of evidence is indeed evidence of absence. First off, Dunning didn't only find that there were no records of a missing 5-year-old, he also found that there simply wasn't any record of any missing persons in Hoia Baciu. This is quite odd, especially when you compare Hoia Baciu to other creepy places known for mysterious disappearances. I mean, consider the Bermuda Triangle, for instance, or the Alaska Triangle. Hundreds to thousands of disappearances have been traced back to these mysterious spots. But these disappearances have records, real-world records that prove that the disappearance cases are not made up. People actually did go missing, and they went missing in these mysterious places. So it begs the question of why we don't have the same for Hoia Baciu. There's simply no mention of the disappearance and reappearance of this little girl in the local papers, not even a uniform story about the incident. It seems to me that this story is probably not true. I mean, yes, in spite of all these, the story could still be true, but considering everything we've looked at, I, for one, doubt its truthfulness. Moving on to the second point, let's talk about the so-called geomagnetic anomalies. It is said that compasses fail to point north at Hoia Baciu, and that electronics randomly malfunction and stuff. However, once again, there's no record of this so-called geomagnetic anomaly in any of the appropriate databases. In carrying out his investigations, Brian Dunning scanned through the databases of geomagnetic data and found that there was no significant variance of the Earth's magnetic field in and around Hoia Baciu. Once again, this is inconsistent with what we know from other similar sites. Claims of electromagnetic anomalies are usually scientifically observable. This is not the case with Hoia Baciu, which, once again, puts a serious dent into the haunted claims that surround Hoia Baciu. Finally, let's talk about the mysterious clearing where nothing grows allegedly, aka the Poiana Rotunda. Most stories about Hoia Baciu and its mysterious circular clearing claim that the clearing is perfectly circular and completely barren. Some even go as far to claim that soil samples have been taken from the clearing for testing, and some hints of radiation were found in them. But this is simply untrue on several counts. First off, Poiana Rotunda is not perfectly circular. But secondly, and more importantly, the clearing is not exactly barren. Quite the opposite. The clearing is actually lush and full of beautiful wildflowers and some grass. In other words, Hoia Rotunda is just a meadow. Yes, trees don't grow there, but that isn't because of some otherworldly influence that can't be explained. It's not even unique. There are several reasons meadows don't support the growth of trees and other plants. Okay, time for a quick science class. So when it comes to the plant communities in meadows, it's usually a mixed bag. However, for the most part, what you're going to find are herbaceous plants. Herbaceous plants don't need a lot of depth for their root system. A depth of 1 meter or less is fine, which is why they can grow in meadows which often have shallow underlying bedrock that prevents tree roots from taking hold. Or in other cases, they are wetlands that don't support wooded growth. For the Poiana Rotunda, it could be either of those reasons, or a mix of both. Plus, let's not forget that Hoia Baciu is a small forest. And with a smaller forest, you get lots of open spaces, as vegetation isn't dense. These open spaces, as well as the direct sunlight that shines onto these spots, allow for meadows to form. This is unlike thick forests, where trees are packed together and sunlight can hardly get into the forest, thereby destroying every possibility of a meadow forming, as herbaceous plants need sunlight to grow. So, that's all there is to it. The so-called mysteriously barren clearing is not barren at all. It's a meadow, which also debunks the claim that the soil samples from that site were tested and found to be plagued with radiation. Because, once again, the claims are unsubstantiated. There are no records anywhere of Hoia Baciu being riddled with radiation. And even if we did, it still wouldn't prove anything, as we've seen places destroyed by radiation go on to support lush plant life. I mean, does it get any worse than Chernobyl when we're talking of radiation? Yet, here's Chernobyl with loads of trees and plants, despite the large-scale nuclear disaster that happened there nearly 40 years ago. Once again, the claims unravel. So, what's the verdict? Honestly, it doesn't seem like there's any real paranormal activity going on in Hoia Baciu. And I'm saying this with the full knowledge of some pretty intense experiences coming out of this forest. My main concern, as I've pointed out, is that Hoia Baciu does not behave similarly to other known mystery cases. In other known mystery cases like, say, Mount Kailash or the Alaska Triangle, the strange phenomena are actually scientifically measurable, even though skeptics typically come to a different conclusion in trying to explain them. It's not the case with Hoia Baciu, where the so-called signs experienced by visitors to the forest have no grounding in reality. But even at that, I still do not think that the Hoia Baciu mystery has necessarily been fully solved now, because the truth is that people felt something. So how do we explain that? Well, it could be a number of things. In the first place, it could be psychological. Forests are naturally eerie, thanks to their isolated location and dense vegetation. Hoia Baciu is even eerier, with its strangely shaped trees, most of which are probably the result of natural factors, by the way, like lightning strikes, poor soil conditions, or strong winds, rather than paranormal influence. Then there's also the power of suggestion. Humans have a beautiful mind. Tell them to look out for a ghost, and 9 out of 10 times, their mind will take it up from there and manufacture poltergeist activity even when there is none. The stories about Hoia Baciu and its reputation as a haunted spot could be priming visitors to expect paranormal activity such that even perfectly normal phenomena could easily be misinterpreted as paranormal activity. But hey, could I be wrong? Definitely. These are just my theories. If you think there are factors I'm overlooking, feel free to let me know by dropping a comment. In the meantime, if you want to check out what I consider to be a truly creepy place, be sure to watch my video on the Alaska Triangle. If you think the Bermuda Triangle is scary, this place makes it look like a walk in the park.